We've scoured the web and conducted numerous interviews to find individuals with some incredible paranormal experiences from their time in the military, from Bigfoot-like creatures to UAP and things more terrifying. These are some of the most terrifying military paranormal encounters you've ever heard. The Vietnam Predator. I don't know if whoever made the Predator movie ever heard this story, or maybe one like it, because mine isn't the only one. But I feel like whoever made that movie knew about these things because the movie is spot on. I was with the 281st Assault Helicopter Company in Vietnam. Our job was to fly Special Forces guys around Vietnam and conduct raids, recon, and all sorts of things. I don't know if they teach this anywhere, but the US invented air assault operations using helicopters, and it was damn effective catching the enemy from behind where they least expected. But it was dangerous because if your intel wasn't good, and a lot of time it wasn't, you could end up smack dab in the middle of two NVA forces. Well, what we did was sorta like that, only more dangerous because we worked in smaller teams. Anyway, my chopper went down in 67. It wasn't enemy fire or anything like that, it was the transmission. Nowadays you got redundancies, but the Huey was pretty new and had a lot of single points of failure. The shops kept our choppers in good working order, so I don't know, maybe it was just bad luck. It wasn't that bad of a crash, thanks to the tree canopy and the fact that we were low and slow at the time, but the chopper rolled over as it fell out of the tree about 20 feet to the ground, and that's what killed 3 of our guys instantly, crushing them to death. Now that left me, my co-pilot, and 5 other guys in the back. We had a PRC-10 radio that survived the crash, but the damn thing wouldn't transmit, only receive. I think it got battered about in the crash. We had about a 20-click walk back to the nearest fire base on our map, and that doesn't sound too bad until you figure in the weather in the jungle. The place is a soup of trees and vegetation, slowing you down to just a few clicks a day. We debated staying put and waiting for rescue, but we knew we were close to a major VC operational area, and that's why we were there. If friends had seen the crash and heard our mayday over the radio, so did they. Anyway, we just gathered what we could from the chopper, destroyed some of the more sensitive gear just in case, and moved out. We didn't see it that first night, but we heard it. At first, I thought it was a strange bird. It made this clicking sound, like taking 2 small pieces of metal and clicking them together rapidly. But one of the Special Forces guys said that's no bird. Those boys were trained to know that kind of stuff. It helped them identify sounds in the jungle and all that, so I believed him. We thought it was the VC, so we put our asses in gear. But the sound kept catching up to us, and at one point, it moved past us, just off in the trees, maybe 30-40 meters from us. It was high up, too, like it was moving along the treetops. We froze and took cover thinking it was still VC, but it didn't make any sense. Besides, if there were VC out there, they would have pounced on us. Taking US prisoners was their top priority. During the day, we rested to avoid the worst of the heat, then started moving again late in the day and at night. We were going slow. It was just after heavy rain, so the ground was marshy, and it was awful going. We were making 3 or 4 clicks a day. As soon as we started moving, though, the clicking was there again. It was almost like it was letting us know, okay, you guys are up now, and so am I. It didn't make any noise while we were resting or sleeping. That second night, something walked by in the brush ahead of us. I was near the front and I saw it along with one other guy. I couldn't describe it. It was really dark, and we weren't getting much moonlight through the canopy, but you could clearly see how the darkness changed as something moved in front of us. I hope that makes sense. It was like something big just walking across a gap in the trees ahead of us, and we knew it was there because even though we couldn't really see it, we heard the trees and vegetation as it moved through it. That scared us both witless for a second, and by the time we both brought our rifles up, it was gone. We were expecting enemy contact at any moment, but this was different. It was like we both knew this was something not natural. The next day, we all saw it. We'd taken shelter in a thick copse of trees that provided protection from the sun and pretty good concealment. Suddenly, we heard it. It was moving through the brush again. We thought it must be VC, so we crawled over the edge of our cover where we could look out and open fire if we needed to. The copse of trees was next to a small opening in the jungle with tall grass, and you could see our trail through the tall grass because it was all beaten down. Well, it was a fake trail. 2 guys had taken the time to make a fake trail that led into the jungle on the far end of the field and in big circles to confuse anyone following us. We couldn't see it, but we heard the brush, and then we could spot the vegetation on the far side of the field moving like something was passing through it. Then you could see where it was going because of the way it pushed the grass down as it moved. It went up to our fake trail and it seemed to stop, then it started following it. At this point, it was close enough that you could see the shimmering effect, like in the Predator movie. It was like you could see through it, but everything behind it was distorted. That thing followed the fake trail back into the jungle, and we could hear it moving in the distance. After that, we never saw or heard it again. I don't know if it really lost our trail or maybe it just got bored. I wish the story was more exciting, but it was plenty exciting to us because we lived it. When we got back, we swore we wouldn't tell anybody about what we saw out there because who would believe us? And none of us wanted to get put up for some kind of psychiatric review or anything. I can't tell you much about what it looked like, only that it was big. You could tell from the size of the visual distortion it created and all the grass and vegetation it pushed out of its way. I don't know if it was alien or anything like that, I just know what I saw. And I know that plenty of other people saw things like that too. The dream. It was the mid-2000s and I was on a security patrol guarding an Air Force installation. I worked the midnight shift at the time, and even though it was strictly prohibited and you could get in serious trouble for it, it was common practice for people to do what we call one up, one down. In other words, I nap for an hour or two while you stay alert, and then we swap. When you're stuck in a Humvee without even a radio to listen to, and overnight on a 12-hour shift, it's almost impossible to not fall asleep. One night I had a strange dream while it was my turn to be down. In my dream, I woke up from my nap and I looked across at my partner, who was dead asleep. I didn't realize I was dreaming, and I got really angry, so I reached over to shake him awake. He didn't even stir, though no matter how hard I shook him. Suddenly, I happened to glimpse a figure in front of the Humvee and turned my attention to the darkness around us. To my surprise, a bunch of people stepped out of the shadows and completely surrounded the Humvee, standing shoulder to shoulder. But what alarmed me the most was that these weren't really people, at least not in the face. There was just enough light to see that their faces were all wrong. They had no noses, tiny mouths with a very pointy chin, and their skin was really pale. And they had giant eyes that almost stretched to the sides of their head. It freaked me out, and I reached for my weapon, but I couldn't pull it free for some reason. I tugged, and despite it not being stowed or latched onto anything, it was as if I wasn't even strong enough to budge it. Then all of a sudden I woke up for real, and I looked over to realize my partner was asleep. For a second I had a flashback to the dream and a bit of paranoia, but there was nobody around us, and my partner woke up when I angrily shook him. He apologized and said he had no clue how he'd fallen asleep. I didn't think much of it until several weeks later, when I went to our small break room to heat up my dinner. There was another patrol sitting there, and one of the guys was talking in a hushed tone. My ears pricked up when he mentioned having a strange dream out on patrol, and then it blew me away when he started retelling exactly that same dream. I thought it must have been some type of prank, but there was no way anyone else knew about my dream because I never told anyone, not even my partner, on the night it happened. I started talking to people and found that 3 other people had the same dream in the last 2 months, and all of us had been assigned to the exact patrol when it happened. I don't know what it means, but to this day, I can picture those faces, which terrifies me. Afghanistan Beast. Part of our job in Afghanistan was to provide security for State Department personnel and intelligence guys as they went to visit tribal chiefs way up in the mountains. There were few roads, and it was a dangerous job. But early on in the war, it was important in order to secure alliances, or at least assurances, that the tribes wouldn't attack NATO interests. We paid the tribes large sums of money to either help us or at least not actively hurt us. These people lived very simple lives up there in the mountains. There are barely any that have electricity up there, and if they do, it's usually some old generator. I don't think anyone up there has ever seen a TV or a movie in their life, and that's important for what's coming next. I also know what we experienced was real because I heard it from the other guys who did these trips up into the mountains. The chief we talked to on this trip was pretty friendly to us, and it probably helped that we'd funneled something like $20,000 to him since the war began. An absolute fortune to these people. We were up on a goodwill tour, showed our faces, had the medics treat a few people, and reminded everyone we were their friends. This was important because they controlled a pass through the mountains and kept the Taliban or terrorist forces from using it for us. Anyway, we'd settled for dinner when suddenly one of the young boys came running in a panic. He was white as a sheet. I can't understand him, but he keeps saying one word over and over again while gesturing out. There was a big commotion, and a few of the men gathered rifles and started rushing out into the night. Our Terp translated what he could for us, but he never heard this word that they'd kept using before. So we ran after them, thinking maybe it was the bad guys about to ambush us. We always kept our gear within arm's reach, even though it was seen as a bit of an affront to the locals. We were supposed to be safe with them. Money and medicine smoothed over any offense, though. We followed the group of men to the edge of the village where the older boys had herded the livestock into corrals for the night. There was always a small group of lookouts there, mostly just for predators, though there was the occasional bandit, they said. Well, when we got there, the place was a mess. One of the boys was unconscious, and an old Kalashnikov was lying by his side. He'd been the only one armed, and there was no sign of the other boys. There was a small mixed herd of sheep and goats, along with some donkeys and a few mules. The animals were all going crazy. We could see a blood smear on the ground that the animals had all avoided, and damage to the wooden fence from where it looked like something big had knocked into it. They kept repeating that word, and the men rushed out into the dark. We followed, still not sure what was going on. I had a thermal sight that I used to scan ahead of us, and I spotted a large heat source close to the ground. I thought it must have been a very big rock that was still radiating heat from the sun, until suddenly the thing stood up. And I do mean stood, as in it was on two legs. That thing let out a horrible scream like nothing I'd ever heard. It was like a mix of the Jurassic Park T-Rex and the shriek of a jet engine, starting off really bassy and ending up in a high pitch. We must have been at least 70 meters away when it roared, and I swear I could still feel it in my chest. The men seemed nonplussed though, and they just started firing at it. But I could see through my thermal as it just bounded away at incredible speed, out of sight and over a ridge in seconds. Nobody chased the creature further, probably because it was a waste of time. That thing was too fast. Turns out whatever it was had snuck up to the animal pens, knocked out the oldest boy who had the gun. I don't know how it got so close. The boys admitted they had been preoccupied and talking amongst themselves, probably excited over our arrival, a bunch of white and black strangers. Plus, the other villagers later told us, through our interpreter, that those things were sneaky. It's like impossibly sneaky. So it took two of the sheep, full-grown animals, and just stepped over the small fence. I know it did that because I saw the footprints, massive tracks easily over 14 inches long, and they were clear in the dirt of the pens and around them. Through our interpreter, the villagers told us that these giants, I don't remember the exact name they had for them, but it translated to something like devil giant if I remember right. Anyway, these giants would snatch livestock at night, moving up really stealthy and then just taking off at incredible speeds with a screaming animal. Nobody was allowed to travel far from the village on their own either. Sometimes these things would be in the canyons and the ridges around the village, throwing rocks at people or scaring them with screams like the one we heard. The thing is, everyone treated this thing, basically an Afghanistan Bigfoot from their description, like it was a totally normal thing that happened. The villagers weren't too surprised, even though one of them had knocked out the oldest kid, the one with the gun. And that's kind of terrifying because it means that this thing was smart enough to know what a gun was and identify who had it. I guess this is just an animal or a thing that they've been living with for generations, and for all our fancy tech that we brought to hunt terrorists and bad guys down, we had no clue they even existed. I'm gonna be honest with you, after seeing how massive the thing was and how fast it moved, even with all our firepower, I don't know that we could have survived a group of them swarming down on us from the ridges. It made the trip home even more nerve-wracking than normal as we went down the valleys to what passed for civilization, and I never liked going back up into the mountains after that. The Shadow People. My first deployment was to Iraq, and to run convoys no less. I knew it was a dangerous job because it was when we were most exposed, and I'm not ashamed to say I was terrified. Well, things only got worse when one of our vehicles broke down in the middle of nowhere. And I mean the absolute middle of nowhere. There weren't even any locals around, and that's how far out in the desert we were. Well, we couldn't just abandon the vehicle and all the equipment it was carrying, so we radioed for help. A tow vehicle would be dispatched, but it would take a few hours for one to be available, and then it would take several more hours to get security for the vehicle together, and then it actually has to reach us, and that meant we were staying overnight. Maybe I was naive, but I was sure we'd be ambushed or something. We were a perfect target, stuck out in the middle of hostile territory with no friendly forces anywhere nearby. I now know that there's always air support flying patrols 24/7 in case a group like us get in trouble, but I didn't know that back then, so it was extra terrifying to just be sitting there when the sun went down. We'd set up 360 security with the vehicles at the center, kind of made me think that that's what must have been like for the early wagon trains crossing the West. Everyone was pitching in that night, so everyone would take at least one shift of watch. Well, early in the night, one of the guys said he was seeing figures out in the desert. Nobody was sleeping, so we went over to check it out. At first, you couldn't see anything, but eventually you could spot them. It looked just like people out there walking back and forth. I'm not trying to be sneaky or anything. You could just see them through the night vision even better, but you couldn't make out any details. They just looked like shadows. We thought they might be Bedouin or something, but they never came close to us, and they stayed far enough away that we didn't feel that they were a threat. But at one point, one of the guys actually shone his weapon's laser at one of the figures, and it just disappeared when it hit it. This is an infrared laser, so it doesn't give off visible light, but the thing just disappeared the moment that it hit it, and you could see it if you had night vision. Those things were just out there the entire night, always far enough away to not feel like a threat, but just walking back and forth. I don't think there was a single watch that night that didn't see them, and let me tell you, I've never been so glad to see the sun come up before. Benning Bigfoot. I don't know what they call Fort Benning now. I just know they renamed it. But back when I was there, if you actually worked out there at the ranges, you knew Bigfoot was real and nobody doubted it. Every time a new guy would come in, you'd try to warn him and they'd laugh and think it was a joke, but eventually they'd see one for themselves and know we weren't joking around. The ranger staff knew too. More than one group of ranger babies out there in the woods during their training ran into one. But outside of the groups that knew, nobody talked about it. It was a big joke to everyone else, and that kind of pisses me off. So the things would show up mostly around the wintertime when the ranges weren't as busy. I don't know really why they preferred that area, with all that gunfire. You'd think that they'd be intimidated away, but I think they knew that the guns got used only on the ranges. And of course, there was absolutely no hunting or camping or hiking anywhere near those ranges, or else people would get shot up. The no hunting thing was also probably why they were out there so much. It meant they didn't get bothered, but also that what they ate didn't get bothered. That's deer, by the way. I guess they probably eat other stuff, but I know for a fact they eat deer because we saw them hunting them. I think that's also why they might have liked the ranges. They were big spans of empty land, and the deer would have come through there if there hadn't been any firing going on over the last few days. That big open area was perfect for the Bigfoot, or the Sasquatch, or whatever you call them. It lets them run real fast without getting worried about being tripped up in the brush, I guess. The first time I saw one for myself, we were doing some maintenance on one of the range towers, just replacing some rotten boards, nothing major. Suddenly, we heard what sounded like a freight train crashing through the trees somewhere downrange, and a moment later, the biggest sumbitch you've ever seen comes tearing out of there. That thing must have been over 10 feet tall, easily 7, maybe 800 pounds. It was running so fast, you could feel its steps even from where we were, and it was gunning straight for a group of spooked deer. Now, deer are fast, but this thing was faster, and it caught up to one in no more than maybe 15 steps total. It had so much momentum that they both went tumbling, and this Bigfoot smashed straight into the tree cover on the other side of the range, tearing the vegetation all up. I didn't see it again after that. I think it took off through the tree cover, but there's no way it didn't know we were there with all the noise we'd been making beforehand. The deer didn't really mind because they were used to us, and I guess these things were too. At least it seemed that way as I found out. You'd find footprints. Sometimes the shooters would find them and get scared or claim we were trying to prank them. We didn't pay them any mind and didn't try to make anyone believe us either. It'd be a waste of time. We knew they were there and we liked it that way. It made us feel kind of special. And the last thing I wanted was a bunch of idiots coming off duty and doing something stupid in the woods. Maybe getting shot up by people doing night fire or something. Don't underestimate grunt stupidity. I sometimes spotted one or two when the range was live. You'd get to know where to look. These things, they like to hide and they're experts at it. They know exactly where to sit, so their dark hair or fur or whatever blends into the shadows in the trees. But they're curious, and their faces don't have much hair on them, so if you knew where to look and you had a pair of binoculars, you could spot them sometimes. Always to one side or the other of the range, and they just sit there and watch us fire off our rounds. I think maybe they liked it, the way most little boys love to see someone shooting a gun. I think maybe we aren't too different, to be honest. They sure did seem intelligent to me, just more primitive. The locals, they know they're there, especially those living on the outskirts of Columbus. I don't know if it's still there, but there used to be a road that connected the backside of Benning with Columbus, and it ran right past the ranges. People would see them on that road, though hardly anyone really took it. Still, if you drove down that road late at night, there's a good chance you'd see one or you'd have stuff thrown at your vehicle. I know one family that had one run right up next to their speeding van and smack the side of their vehicle. I don't know why they do that. And maybe they just like the thrill like every dumb human that does a dangerous thing. We never had any problems with them. They never had any problems with us. They did like to play pranks though. We used to have to gather big garbage bags full of brass and get it ready for the trucks to pick them up and take them to the dump. Well, you'd stack those bags together and then come back and they'd have moved the bags around the parking lot. They never tore them up or anything like that. It's like they just knew we'd put in a lot of hard work and they didn't want to make a mess for us. That's why I say they're intelligent, just playful like children. Still, I don't think I'd ever want to run into one at night by myself. I don't think they mean to hurt anyone, but something that big is just terrifying on its own. The Visitor. I shot and killed an old woman when I was overseas. It was my last deployment. People tell me it was an accident, but that always felt like a cop-out. We got ambushed in a crowded street by a small group of gunmen. They opened up on us and caught a few civilians in the crossfire themselves. I admit, I panicked and I started firing without really paying attention to where I was shooting. She ducked into a doorway somewhere behind and to the left, and I watched her crumple as several 5.56 rounds punched into her. An autopsy later confirmed it was NATO standard ammo. My NATO standard ammo. 2 of our own died that day in the ambush, but it was her face I kept seeing. They ended up flying me back to Ramstein, then to the East Coast. There's nothing wrong with me physically, but they asked me if I was having suicidal thoughts, and I kept saying yes. I did the various therapies, and eventually the military separated me. I kept going for treatment at the VA, eventually managing to feel somewhat normal again. My wife and I moved to Virginia to be close to a VA facility for mental health services, and I was working security just to make ends meet. I couldn't pull myself together to do much more than that, so both of us were working. Only I worked the night shift a lot, which meant that I'd be home alone while my wife was at work. I started to notice things were off. I'd go to sleep with the bedroom door closed and wake up to it wide open. Sometimes I'd find the closet door and my dresser drawers were wide open too. We had a German Shepherd at the time, and despite being easily over 100 pounds, he started pissing himself and hiding under any furniture he could fit under. But whenever my wife was around, he acted all right. She started accusing me of abusing the dog, and I was furious and appalled that she thought I could do such a thing. In hindsight, I think that was its plan. The thing, the demon or the ghost or whatever it was. I think it stirred up trouble on purpose. And I think it knew my wife loved that dog, which is why it targeted it. It wanted to drive a wedge between us, to make us fight. It fed off all of our negative emotions. The angrier or more scared we got, the stronger it became. And the stronger it became, the more ways it would manifest itself. I had to pause to say, I owe my wife everything. I can't believe she stayed with me through everything. But she saved my life twice. Once when I got back home from Iraq, the last time, and once more during this ordeal. I think that thing wanted me to die. I think that was its purpose. The first time it got physical, I woke up to the dog growling. He would sleep at the foot of our bed or on the side, usually my wife's side. She was still asleep, but I could see Buck, our dog, growling at something in the doorway. As usual, we closed the bedroom door, but it was now open again. There was nothing there, but Buck could see it, and I watched him as he tracked it, entering the room and approaching the bed. Buck backed off and moved by my wife as she slept, still growling and baring his fangs at something now at the foot of the bed. I was going to get out of bed, but I was afraid that if I did, it would attack my wife instead, so I stayed put, not sure what to do, what I could do. Suddenly, I felt ice wrap itself around one of my ankles, and the thing yanked me hard from the foot of the bed. Buck started barking like crazy and even lunged forward at empty air. That woke my wife up, and she found me half on the bed as I tried to free myself from the bedsheets. I couldn't stand. The thing had yanked me so hard by the ankle, it had dislocated my knee. My wife rushed me to the hospital, and they were stunned to see my ankle bruised a deep purple. After seeing x-rays, the doctor told me that it was as if I'd been jerked violently and asked if I'd been in a car accident. I told her the same thing I told the nurse. I fell out of bed in my sleep. She was skeptical, but didn't press the issue. In a way, when the thing hurt me, it actually helped me too. My wife now believed me when I told her I wasn't doing anything to Buck. I told her about everything that had gone on while she was gone. The door to the bedroom opening, the sound of footsteps, strange smells, and cold spots that seemed to move around the house. The thing had been trying to drive us apart, make me feel like my only anchor in the world was abandoning me. But when it hurt me, It only drew us closer together. Now she believed me, and now we were in this fight together. I've never been religious despite growing up in a Christian home. Sure, I prayed a few times when I was overseas, but who didn't? And I never took it seriously. So I doubted God was taking me seriously when I did pray. My wife, though, had been a practicing Christian her whole life, and the first thing she did was turn to the church. The local church, however, had no clue what to do for us. I'm not even sure they believed her. But that didn't stop her. She just looked for a church in the next town, and so on, until someone decided that they could do something. But now it was like the thing knew it was under threat, that it knew its time was limited. It went into overdrive. One night we were having dinner, watching TV together, when suddenly the remote floated up into the air on its own, right in front of us. It hung there for a second, then suddenly darted toward me, almost like something was about to throw it. My wife, by instinct, yelled out, "Jesus!" like crying for help in a kind of way, and the remote just stopped. It jerked toward me again, and my wife called out Jesus' name again, but the remote stopped again. My wife started praying out loud, and suddenly something screamed like a real loud scream right in front of us, and the remote flew at us. It passed right between our heads and smashed to pieces on the wall behind us. It was like the thing was angry and furious at my wife's prayers. It had tried to hit one of us in the face with that remote, but something had deflected it. One night it attacked me directly again. My wife gave me a crucifix to wear, and I wore it daily. I woke up one night choking, and I could hear Buck barking, going crazy. My vision was dimming rapidly though, and I couldn't breathe. But I could hear my wife screaming at Buck, still going nuts, even as my vision dimmed. My wife later told me that she'd started praying again. I don't know, I could hear her, but it was distant, like she was down a long hallway. Anyways, that must have been when the thing stopped trying to choke me. I had a bloody red line across the front of my neck from the chain of the crucifix digging into my flesh. My wife told me that when Buck woke her up with all his barking, she'd looked over and seen something pulling on the crucifix down toward the ground on my side of the bed. She said it was like something was lying on the floor, tugging that crucifix down as hard as it could to choke me out. Then when she started praying, it just let go. I don't know how to explain it, but I wasn't afraid for myself after that. I was scared for my wife and for Buck. I was terrified it would change its mind about targeting me and to go after them instead. Unfortunately, I was right. I'm not sure what happened. A neighbor saw it and relayed to me what he saw. We had a small front yard with a wooden picket fence. Buck was big but really friendly and loved to meet the neighbor kids by the fence so they could pet him and scratch his ears. We were never really scared of him getting loose, but we kept the gate locked just in case. But like I said, Buck was big. He could have jumped that fence anytime he wanted to if he really set his mind to it. My neighbor said that's exactly what happened. He was mowing his lawn and got distracted by Buck going crazy. According to him, Buck was growling and snapping at something in the yard, and he seemed to follow it all the way to the fence. Suddenly, Buck jumped the fence as if he was chasing something only he could see. It led him right into the street, just as someone in a big F-150 was barreling down the road. Anyone who's ever sat in one of those things knows that it's impossible to see anything at a certain height over that big hood. The driver never even saw Buck run out in front of him, and he didn't even hit the brakes. I know it lured him out there, and I know it was because it was angry at Buck for waking my wife up and saving my life. We were devastated by Buck's death. But if it was trying to make us despair, it failed miserably. We were more determined than ever to get rid of this thing. We knew we had to get rid of it because we weren't making much money. Moving just wasn't an option, and besides, I knew it was personal. I don't know how I knew, I just did. Luckily for us, it wasn't too long after that we finally got some help. We had no luck finding any church to help us, but my wife was pointed toward a church outside of Luray, Virginia. It was a small town, real rural. The church itself was a small country church with a mostly black congregation, and we certainly raised a few eyebrows when we showed up for a Sunday worship. It was more because they simply weren't expecting visitors, not necessarily the color of our skin. We spoke to the preacher after the service. He listened to our story and took notes while we were talking. Then he said he'd be happy to help. When he smiled at me as he said that, it was like the clouds parted for the first time in nearly 2 years. I can't explain it any other way. It was like God was telling me everything was gonna be all right. It took 3 visits for the thing to finally leave me alone. I don't want to talk about what happened during those visits. It was personal and it got really bad sometimes, really bad. But this thing was attacking me and everyone involved at a deeply personal level. It was in fight or flight mode, pulling out all the stops. I'll say this though, that church came to our house and filled it with light. And I do mean the church. They came up in 2 vans, a whole group of them. The preacher said this wasn't a one-man job. That's not how God's kingdom works. Everyone was there to fill our home with love and drive this thing out. It was like the color returned to both our lives when it was gone. I can't tell you how grateful my wife and I are to everyone who helped. The preacher told us that we were dealing with a demon, one whose kind can only be driven out with love. I don't know if it was a demon. Sometimes I think, and back then I did think, that it was the spirit of that old woman. But the preacher told me that's just what it wanted me to think, because it wanted me to feel guilty, to feel responsible. It wanted me to dwell on the negativity, so it could feed off me. The Gulf of Mexico Monster. During the Cold War, there was a very real concern that a Soviet sub would try to infiltrate the Gulf of Mexico and carry out sabotage operations against the oil rigs we set up there. Thus, the Gulf, like the east and west coasts of the US, was ringed with underwater sensors, listening in on anything transiting the waters. Over the years that those sensors have been running, the Navy has developed an extensive database on the sounds of the oceans. They use this database to train submariners and ASW officers. It used to require a skilled sonar man that could identify the exact type of ship or boat by the noise it gave off. But now, they've got AI for that. Same goes for all kinds of different sea life. I'm not talking about just whale calls. You see, everything gives off noise as it moves, hunts, even defecates underwater. Most of that sea life is too small to really register unless it's really close to a sensor or traveling in large schools. Sweden once thought Russian submarines were violating its waters, but it discovered it was just giant schools of herrings farting. Big sea life is the most detectable for obvious reasons, and today's submariners and ASW officers are all skilled in identifying the sounds of whales and other large sea life. But back in the 80s, when I was in charge of coordinating ASW activities for the Gulf of Mexico, we found something else entirely. It's hard to describe unless you listen to it directly, but it was something like a very loud bloop noise that would repeat. It sounded off across the Gulf starting in the early 80s, and it would repeat during the winter months, year after year. At first, we thought it must be geologic activity, but the fact that it repeated and seemed to travel across the Gulf ruled that out pretty quickly. We brought in a few NOAA scientists to try to figure out what this thing was, and they came up with 2 conclusions. One, it was biological, and second, given the strength of the signal and the time it took to reach a second sensor, it was big, very big. Much bigger than any other known sea life in the world, including the blue whale. Whatever the creature was, if it was in fact a creature, it swam deep as it stuck to the deeper channels in the Gulf. I know local fishermen, especially those on the Mexico side, talk about monster sharks out in the deep water, but even the biggest fishtail I ever heard paled in comparison to the size estimate that the NOAA scientists gave us, something to the order of 800,000 pounds, nearly 3 times the mass of a blue whale. This was an estimate, of course. Due to national security concerns, we weren't able to give them the highest resolution data we had, which could have helped fix that estimate better. But clearly, whatever this thing was, it was very large, and it moved very quickly underwater. Its estimated speed was around 30 knots, so it's pretty close to a sub. And as far as I'm aware, the Navy never discovered the source. But I was made aware years later by some buddies of mine that they had tracked a very similar contact across the Atlantic SOSUS network. It had apparently even appeared in the Pacific, which makes the possibility of this being biological even stronger, as it would indicate a breeding population of multiple animals across multiple oceans. However, because these things always kept to the deep, it was impossible to get eyes on them or anything like that. And that deep terrain helped mask any noise they made, so tracking them, even with our sensor network, was all but impossible. We could only detect them briefly when they rose to shallower waters before plunging back into the deep again. Dead lights of Indian Springs. Before deploying overseas in Iraq, my unit went to Indian Springs for some pre-deployment training. It's a small Air Force installation way out in the desert north of Las Vegas. Not very built up, or at least it wasn't when I was there. We spent a lot of time at the range, especially with heavier weapons. We also worked with some drones that we'd be trying out in the field for the first time, and did a lot of general desert training. One day we booted it for an entire day and headed straight out into the desert. Then we stayed out there for the night and booted it back the next. We set up a defensive position the way we would have if we'd really been out on a long-range patrol and had to stay the night out. But despite carrying rifles, we had no live ammo with us. Still, this was US soil, so spending a night out in the desert didn't seem like a big deal. Sometime in the night, I was shaken awake by one of my squatties, who told me that I had to check some strange things out. I followed him to an embankment near the edge of where we'd set up, and I saw at least half the platoon was already there, including the platoon sergeant, who'd normally be cussing us all out for not taking training seriously. But when I saw what I saw, I knew why everyone was gathered there. They'd been watching this for at least 10 minutes before I got there. But when I saw it, all it was a small light way out in the desert. Thought it was some dirt biker or something with a flashlight. But then we'd watch that light float into the sky. Not very high, maybe only a few hundred feet, but then it floated back down. When it was back down on the desert floor, 2 more lights, one red and one orangish, appeared on either side of the original bright amber light, and the 3 seemed to move together across the desert. We watched them for about 15 minutes after I got there, so in total, they must have been active for almost half an hour. They moved close enough to us that we could see them illuminate the desert around them, but we never felt like they were threatening. It was just kinda surreal and beautiful at the same time. I think we all felt at peace as we sat there watching them. Towards the end, it was like all 3 of the lights merged back together and suddenly flew up into the sky. So fast that it was almost a if you blink, you miss it moment. We didn't see anything else the rest of the night, even though most of us stayed up looking despite it not being our watch. We talked about it together the entire march back. And then when we got back, we talked to a few of the installation personnel about it. They said they'd seen those lights before, and they weren't frequent, but they weren't rare either. One of them, some Air Force sergeant with a Native American name, can't remember, they said that they were dead lights. They were supposed to be spirits coming down to Earth briefly, and you weren't supposed to mess with them or they could do things like make you sick or even burn you if you got close enough. The big lie. I got my start in Army counterintelligence and then made the switch to PsyOps. It was a natural fit because I was never quite the right fit for the Army. PsyOps is still Army, but it's less Army than the rest of the Army, and it places a premium on unique thinkers. Thanks to what you see on TV, I've known about the UFO phenomenon pretty much my entire life. When we were gearing up to knock Saddam Hussein's door down the first time around, I came up with the idea to spook the Iraqis with fake UFOs. The thinking was that if we could get the Iraqis to be thinking about space aliens, then they'd be thinking less about some of the advanced US aircraft that would be the tip of the spear. By now, I was part of a working group that consisted of personnel from the Air Force and the Navy, most of them Vietnam vets looking for fresh ideas from a younger crowd. They dug the UFO idea, and it was a simple matter to construct them. All it took was some drones, same kind we used for air-to-air live fire training, and stripping them down as much as possible. In the end, we ripped the engine out of them and tossed pretty much everything but the electronics away, instead using some pretty durable plastic concoction a Navy research lab had come up with for the body. This significantly reduced the drone's radar return, making it not quite invisible but stealthy enough that it would sporadically show up on radar rather than produce a solid track. It was exactly the effect we wanted. The problem was that the material was relatively fragile, far too fragile to make any kind of large aircraft or anything that needed to perform aggressive maneuvers. But we weren't concerned with that. Our drones would fly low and fast, but not make any big turns. And if they crashed or tore themselves apart or got shot down, well, that was all part of the plan. To make them more UFO-like, we rigged the exterior with all sorts of lights and lasers that could shoot down at the ground. It was a really haunted house with spook show stuff by the time we were done. The problem was that the jet engine still sounded like a jet engine. So the Air Force boys devised several air inlets that would produce a high-pitched humming sound as the drone sped along. Combined with the jet engine sound, it made for a really weird, strange sound that you wouldn't immediately recognize as a jet, especially if you were seeing a formation of these things putting on a strange light show and shooting down to the ground with their lasers. We knew it might not fool the more senior Iraqi personnel, but the bulk of Saddam's army at the time were conscripts, and a fairly superstitious lot too. All we had to do was put the spook in them and confuse their chain of command with outlandish reports. Days before the first US aircraft entered Iraqi airspace, we flew our first fleet of drones, 4 drones to a flight, 12 flights in total. Now, these things had no transponders or anything like that. They weren't even designed to fly home. When their mission was done, they would just crash into the desert. They had their flight routes pre-programmed, and they didn't even carry a radio or any sort of communications equipment. They were all disposable. We could track them down when they were close to our Patriot radars, but once they got within 20 clicks or so out, it was difficult to get a good lock on them. We'd penetrated Iraqi radar nets pretty deeply by then, and we could listen to their radio chatter across the entire southern sector in real time. Sure enough, the reports started coming in. with strange lights in the sky and craft shooting beams of lights down at the ground. After the second invasion, we got our hands on Iraqi military documents. These confirmed the confusion that we'd sown across their air defense networks, which got blindsided by real attack aircraft and cruise missiles shortly after. After Desert Storm, I was invited into a very special working group made up of representatives from the three major branches: the Army, Air Force, and the Navy. My job was simple. Given my PSYOPs background, I was in charge of lying to the American people about UFO sightings. Anytime someone in the US saw a weird light or a strange craft in the sky, it was my job to cook up a good lie about it or find a way to discredit the witness or the sighting. I'd love to say it was a challenging job, demanding years of training and experience, but the truth is, it was easy to dispel a UFO sighting. You see, people fall into two categories: people who are open to believing in UFOs, and people who absolutely will not or don't want to believe in UFOs. The second group is the "I'll believe when a little green man comes right up to my door" type, and they make up the majority of people. All you have to do is offer the most bare, minimum, reasonable, naturalistic, rational-sounding explanation. They'll latch onto it for all it's worth, which is ironic, of course, because these are the same people who always demand the highest levels of proof. At the same time, they themselves are perfectly happy to accept the most ridiculous but normal explanation possible. All you have to do is lean on these people, give them the explanation they seek, and then sit back and watch them do their job for you. They'll enforce a ridiculous culture so complete that few witnesses are ever really willing to come forward and risk their reputation or even livelihood. Sometimes they'll need a little push, especially when the incident is a major one. There was one back in 2008, if I remember correctly, out in Texas, just southwest of Fort Worth. Big UFO got chased by fighter jets, hundreds of witnesses. It was a PR disaster waiting to happen, especially when the local naval air station was slow on the ball and immediately denied any military air traffic in the area at the time of the event. Well, we knew we had a ticking time bomb on our hands, and it was a godsend nobody had a photo or video camera on them at the time. But with that many witnesses, including some pretty respectable members of various communities, this could spiral out of control quickly. So we pushed an explanation through the Air Force. Yes, there had been fighter aircraft in the area during a training exercise, but a miscommunication led to the initial report of no aircraft. That was it. That was all it took to silence the Texas UFO craze and stop it dead in its tracks. A simple, reasonable explanation that made no sense when you listened to what these hundreds of witnesses were telling you, but we put a little pressure on the communities and encouraged people in Fort Worth and around there to drive out there and make fun of the locals a bit. It was easy with modern social media, even back in the late 2000s. One Facebook account can do the work of multiple field agents infiltrating various groups, like the CIA and FBI did looking for communists back in the Cold War. I guess I was part of the second group of people, which makes this even more ironic. To say that I feel stupid now is an understatement. To say that I feel like I was played for an absolute fool for most of my career is an understatement. Here I was, suppressing UFO reports around the country while having a good laugh with the same people who knew these UFOs were actually real. See, I thought that we were just silencing reports on secret American technology because I wanted to believe that's what it was. I had no problem swallowing the same lie that I was telling civilians and even military personnel, and I'm sure some of it was just fancy US tech, but I know for a fact a lot of it wasn't. It's impossible when you listen to the witnesses, and as someone who spent years silencing or suppressing them, let me tell you, many of them are more credible than you'd think. So when someone tells you that they saw a massive mile-long triangular craft that made no noise and it seemed to hover, they're probably telling you the truth because that's precisely what crossed 3 state lines back in the late 90s during the Phoenix Lights case. Now, I wasn't yet a part of the special group for that case, but it was a textbook example of how to handle a mass sighting and suppress witnesses, so they taught it when you joined up. What's strange is that even when I was being told how we had lied about what people had seen, I still bought the lie. I just did not, even for a second, want to believe that there really was a mile-long spaceship of some kind zooming across the American Southwest. I think there are a lot of people who'd be really angry at me if I gave away my identity, and some of them may want to harm me or my family. To be honest with you, I don't really blame them. And if you're listening to this and you're one of those people who saw something incredible and nobody believed you, I'm sorry, genuinely sorry. But this is my confession, my attempt to try to put some right to the wrong I did. No, I'm not worried about the government coming after me. I have lifelines in place. If anything happens to me, there's a way to authenticate a lot of my story that will be immediately made public. Besides, they know better by now. Most people don't want to believe anything strange, so this'll just be another story to them. But if something happened to me, well, suddenly that makes my story a hell of a lot more credible. But don't fool yourself. People still wouldn't believe. They just don't want to, so they never will. No matter how good the evidence, at least not until a little green man walks right up to their front door. The Kraken of Costa Rica. This took place back in the early 2000s. I was part of a Coast Guard crew that went to Costa Rica to help train their guys, and as part of a maritime law enforcement detachment. Sometimes we rode along with them on their own boats, which was easy, considering we donated many of their boats to them. We were doing routine small boat evolutions when there was an emergency distress call over the radio. This wasn't uncommon given how many fishermen worked the water, but this was different. The caller sounded panicked. My Spanish was decent, but the caller was speaking very rapidly, and it was difficult to make out what he was saying. As we sped to their location on 2 small boats, we got the lowdown on the situation. The fishermen said they were under attack by something, and their boat was sinking. The panicked caller insisted that something in the water was attacking them. We assumed it was a shark, and that with their sinking boat, they were in real trouble. Sharks will almost never attack even a small fishing boat, but it might have been lured close by the bloodshed by the fish that the men were catching, and in a frenzy, perhaps it slammed into the side of the boat. We didn't have too much info to go off, given the radio caller stopped answering the radio, but we were at their position no more than 20 minutes later. At a distance, you could see that the small fishing boat was halfway sunk, and the moment we were in view, 2 figures were frantically waving their arms at us as they perched on top of the small cabin. The men were shouting something, again too fast for my Spanish to really comprehend, and pointing at the water as we approached it. I saw it momentarily as we killed the engine and coasted toward the sinking boat. At first I thought we were just passing over a massive bloom of seaweed, but then I realized that the color was wrong. The mass below our boat was grayish and moving slowly under us. Suddenly a massive eye came into view, easily the size of a truck tire. I remember that eye because it seemed to take us all in on that boat. It really gave us a back and forth glance as it slowly drifted past us in a way that just felt intelligent. Then, next came the tentacles, and it was almost too long to believe. It took several seconds for the entire length of the tentacles to move past us, and given its speed, I'd estimate they had to be something like 50 to 60 feet long. I don't know my marine life well enough to tell the difference between a squid and an octopus's tentacles, but when I looked down into the water, the part of the head where there'd been a bell or knot had already moved out of view. I just remembered the massive eye and the terrifying length of its tentacles after. You could see the suckers, each easily as big as a very large dinner plate. I felt my legs freeze in fear, and the other crew who had seen it had also frozen in place. Only the shouting of the skipper and the panicked men as their boat started to sink faster snapped us out of it. I don't know why, but none of us said anything at first. We just rushed to try to get those men off of their boat. But it was too dangerous to pull right up to them. Their sinking vessel might snag onto something on ours and put us both in danger, so they'd have to swim for it as we drew near. The men just about panicked when they realized what they had to do. By now, the Costa Rican guardsmen who'd seen the creature were shouting about it and frantically scanning the water as everyone yelled for the fishermen to swim over. In another few seconds, they had no choice. The boat suddenly started to sink quickly and they were in the water. Each one was hanging onto a life jacket on a rope though, and we tugged them aboard as fast as we could get them. The men told us they'd been fishing and they pulled up a particularly big dorado. At first they celebrated, but as they pulled the thing up to the side of the boat, that's when the massive octopus or the squid struck. It had shot its tentacles upward toward the fish and at the same time wrapped him around the side of the boat, then gave a massive tug that nearly upended the entire boat. The panicked men began to hack at the tentacles with their knives, which must have caused the thing to freak out and lash out with its tentacles, only to get wrapped around the anchor rope. With another massive tug, it ripped the base where the anchor rope was attached, along with shattering part of the side of the boat. The creature freed itself, but it continued swimming around the slowly sinking boat. The men were terrified the creature might pluck them right into the ocean, and from what I'd seen, it probably could have done that. So they first crammed themselves into the small cabin, and once water started flooding it, they climbed on top of it and waited for rescue. Half of the crew believed the men, having seen it for themselves, but the other half didn't. The second boat that had responded with us had been too far off to see the creature swim past. Unfortunately, none of my American colleagues had seen anything either, leaving me feeling kind of alone. Now I can't stop thinking about it anytime I'm near the ocean. I think it's a big part of why I ended my Coast Guard career early and I never wanted to go on vacation somewhere tropical ever since. There have been pieces of monster-sized squids and octopus that have washed up on shore before, but never a complete body. But I know they're out there, and I know that they're a lot bigger than most people would ever believe. The Angel of Landstuhl. I was injured in Afghanistan due to an IED ambush, severe enough that I got medevaced out to Germany. It wasn't bad enough that I needed to fly to the East Coast immediately, so I stayed in Germany for a few weeks. The Landstuhl Clinic used to be a much bigger hospital back in the day. It was established sometime in the 1950s and was expected to handle American casualties in case of war with the Soviets. It got augmented during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it was still relatively small compared to the hundreds of beds it once had. I don't remember much about when I first got there, thanks to the drugs I was on, but I do remember one of the nurses clear as day. She was brunette, older, maybe in her late 40s or early 50s. She was a very motherly figure. Every time she smiled at me, it felt like everything was going to be okay. The morphine was handling my physical wounds, but that nurse's kind gaze and reassuring words were treating my psychological ones. When I was strong enough, I started pacing around the halls outside my room. The medical staff didn't like that very much at first, but I told them it helped me clear my head. And one call from my commander still in Afghanistan to the medical wing's commander silenced their concerns. Usually, my little walks would take place in the evening, when it was nice and quiet, because the daytime hustle still overwhelmed my rattled brain. These weren't long walks. In fact, they were usually just right outside my door and back again before I felt like I had to throw up. Sometimes I was strong enough to make it a bit further, though. I'd often catch sight of the nurse during my evening walks, usually as she was checking in on other patients. She'd stand at the door and smile at them, and a few times I heard her say a few words to the man or woman in their room. Then she'd turn around, usually spot me, smile, and continue her business. I wasn't very fast. I could never really catch up to her, and I didn't want to shout for her since I didn't know her name, and I didn't want to disturb the other patients. Over the weeks, though, I'd see her regularly. Sometimes she'd be in my room as I woke up from a really unpleasant dream, right there by the door, looking at me and smiling. I'd see her and all the negativity would immediately drain out of me. Usually we'd chat for a minute or two before I fell back asleep, thanks to the pain medication, and then I'd always have good dreams. The time came to fly me back home for long-term treatment, evaluation, and possible med boarding out of the military. I was anxious because I hadn't seen the nurse in the days leading up to my departure, so I asked the staff about her. I felt stupid because at the time I'd never even thought of asking for her name, so I just described her. The doctors and the nurse in my room looked confused at first, and then when I described her, the nurse put a hand on her mouth and gasped audibly. It turns out there was no nurse that looked like her, not even a nurse her age on the staff. However, the real nurse was shocked because apparently I was the third person to describe that exact same individual with a similar story. I could tell the doctor was skeptical. He probably thought that we'd all shared the same story somehow, and with a combination of TBI, drugs, and boredom, we'd confused the story as real. But I knew that she was real, and I know that nurse knew that she was real. I don't know who or what she was, maybe a kindly ghost, or maybe angels are real. Maybe she was something else altogether. What I do know is that whenever she was around, I felt all the bad drain away and replaced with positivity. It was like a hit of morphine, but not for your body pain, for your mind and heart pain. The Alaskan Stalker. We were conducting a 10-day trek across the Alaskan wilderness. We were airlifted out via Black Hawk, dropped off and picked up back at our retrieval coordinates. Everything we needed to survive, we either carried on our backs or would scavenge from the environment. It's the type of training that most people dread. But if you've got that unique Special Forces gene, it's the type of thing you live for. We carried rifles with no bolts and simunitions to simulate the weight of real ammo. Our squad did have 2 functional semi-auto shotguns for bear defense, but the mosquitoes would be more worrisome than any bears. Anyone who spent time in Alaska knows the moose are the real killers. Despite being early summer, it was plenty cold, and the mosquitoes were thick thanks to breakup leaving standing water everywhere as trillions of tons of snow melted. It was miserable. It was a miserable wet slog, and I loved every minute of it, despite my aching back. Around the 3rd day, we started getting indications that we were being followed. This wasn't just a cross-country trek for fun. We were moving and behaving as if this was a real deep recon patrol, and the enemy could be anywhere. The guys toward the rear started picking up movement along the shadows in the trees, but we all ignored it, thinking it was probably just a curious animal. With so many of us together, even a pack of wolves would hesitate to attack. Eventually, though, it was becoming clear that something was following us. By the fourth day, it had gotten bold enough to get closer to us, and you could clearly hear it moving through the woods, even though you couldn't really see it in the thick brush. What was strange is that we all agreed whatever it was, it sure as hell sounded bipedal. But try as we might, we never managed to get a sight of it. The thing was very clever too, only moving when we moved, stepping when we stepped. We tried to catch it unawares and planned to all come to a sudden halt. The thing took 2 more steps and then it must have frozen. We hadn't brought any thermals with us. Back then, they were expensive enough that the CO would have docked our pay all the way through retirement if we so much as lost a single unit on a training exercise. We did have night vision though, and on the 5th night I finally got a glimpse of it through the Nogs, at least briefly. When we settled down for the night, the thing seemed to wander off and return just before sunset. While on watch at around 0400 in the morning, I heard the sound of branches moving and caught sight of something large and dark moving very silently through the trees. Whatever it was, it hadn't interfered with us or threatened us, so we eventually ignored it. This seemed to prompt the thing to move even closer, and then on the 6th day, 2 of the guys swore that they finally caught sight of it. Huge, bipedal, long, thick, brownish-blackish hair. They estimated it must have stood at least 9 feet tall, but it moved like a panther, and they knew it was male because they'd seen the thing's sex organs dangling in between all that hair. And to be honest, I don't know what to think. Most of us heard of Bigfoot on TV or in newspapers, and you get people in Alaska talking about him, of course, but despite seeing all the evidence for ourselves, it was just tough to swallow that 2 guys we trusted with our lives in real combat situations had actually seen a Bigfoot stalking us. Well, it didn't take long for the rest of us to become believers. I guess once the thing had figured out that we weren't a real threat, it got curious enough to be less stealthy than normal. I caught a glimpse of it on the 7th day, after nearly the entire rest of the squad had seen it already. Sure enough, this thing was huge, 9 feet tall easy. Big NFL quarterback shoulders that must have been at least 5 feet wide. Its proportions made no sense. I couldn't reason that a thing that massive really existed. If it wanted to, it could have probably killed every one of us, even with our 2 shotguns. I think even if we had been fully armed, it could have killed at least half of us before we put it down. But the thing wasn't hostile. If anything, it was curious. It never came out in the open, but it was close enough at points where we could hear its deep breathing. I think the closest it ever came was maybe 40 feet through thick brush, and you could hear its lungs like big old bellows working. We tossed some sweets from our MREs toward it, and I think at first it spooked it because you could hear it back off through the brush and catch glimpses. But then it slunk back in, and we could hear it sniffing and snuffling as it ate up whatever we threw out there. After that first time, it never ran again when we threw stuff to it. Matter of fact, I think it expected it because every time we sat down for a meal, it would start tossing small pebbles at us. Nothing big enough to hurt, mind you, but enough to get your attention. And it had an incredible aim, even through all that brush. One time it dinged a pebble off my helmet as I was about to take a bite of my lemon pound cake. Everyone laughed, so I broke off a large piece and threw it in its general direction. The only time it appeared to be unhappy was when one of us would go to the bathroom. Now, it had no problem with you going number 2, but it really didn't like us going number 1. We realized that maybe this thing thought it was a territorial thing, so we tried to experiment. We started going number 1 while squatting down, and we'd get no response. But when we peed standing up, that thing would growl menacingly in our direction and usually shake some trees. It must have seen us as rival males at that moment, but when we squatted to pee, it was probably not seen as threatening, because that's how females do it, I guess. Whatever this thing was, Bigfoot or something else, I know it was intelligent in the way man is intelligent. It seemed to know when our trek was over, and after we called in for pickup, it kept its distance. But it was sort of like it wanted to say goodbye or something, I don't know. But as the bird was coming in, it stood out in the open for the first time since we clocked it following us. There was a small clearing on a rise about 150 meters away, and this thing stepped out into the middle of it and just stared down at us, then looked up at the chopper as it started coming in low and plunged back into the woods. Now, he could have stayed hidden like he'd done the entire time, but he made the choice to be seen. I don't care what people think. I think it was saying goodbye in its own way. As soon as we got on the bird, the pilot and the co-pilot were a mess asking us if we'd seen that thing standing out there. I told them I had no idea what they were talking about, and everyone else fell in line with it. I can't explain it, but while we had started this whole thing scared and concerned for our safety, by the end of it we felt kind of protective over that thing. If it wanted to hurt us, it had more than a million chances to do so. But I think it was just curious and keeping tabs on who was walking across his land. And I do mean his land, because there's nothing in the woods out there that can rival him. No bear or moose. If there's more of him, and they're anything like us, he probably had a family out there too, and we were basically striding across his living room. We didn't want anyone out there messing with him, so we didn't say anything to the pilots. And as far as I know, nobody discussed it outside of our little group. I'm connected with 2 or 3 of the guys over Facebook, and we talk about it sometimes. Whatever this thing was, I feel blessed to have seen it. Like I got a peek at one of God's most unique creations. I just hope he's healthy out there, and there's more like him so he's not alone, and that everyone leaves him and his friends the hell alone. Now, go check out Catholic Church's most terrifying ghost stories, or click this other video instead.